This is the moment we've all been waiting for the thousands in attendance and the millions watching around the world. Let's get ready to rumble!
Welcome to your weekly Cleveland Cavalier recap with the Junkyard Pod, hosted by Tony Pesta, Corey Walsh, and Jackson Flickinger. This is a new format we plan on doing throughout the offseason so we can stay on top of everything going on with the Cavs. Today we have stories on Koby Altman's job security, Darius Garland's trade value, and Evan Mobley's potential contract extension. So if this sounds like something you are interested in, please consider hitting subscribe. We all greatly appreciate it. And let's get into our first news story of the week from none other than Cleveland legend and Junkyard Pod fan, Brian Windhorst. And a quick shout out to RealCavsFan.com, who is a great Twitter follow, and he provided a summary of Windy's recent appearance on ESPN Cleveland, where he told us, quote, Koby Altman's status is good, and his contract goes through 2027. His future will be tied to this summer and the coach that he hires, keeping Mitchell and handling the rest of the roster. So, in other words, Koby's job seems to be secure. Let's get into our discussion here, starting with Jackson. Do you believe Koby has earned this job security? And do you think he has done a good job recently or throughout his tenure?
I think he's done a good job in the grand scheme of things. The way that the Cavs were able to quickly rebuild after LeBron was impressive, especially considering how bad the roster looked that first year. So, yes, he's done a good job. I think we've been critical about some of the moves that he seems like he's going to have to be making this summer. We felt that he should have been making them last summer. That includes the JB Bickerstaff firing. That includes potentially breaking up the front court and the back court. We all kind of thought that was something that he could have done last year, but I understand the slow and measured approach. But this is the summer that things are really this is an inflection point for this team and this franchise, and how we remember the Koby Altman tenure will probably be the Kyrie Irving trade and then this. And the Kyrie Irving trade right now doesn't really, it seems like a loss for both sides, and we'll see how this summer is.
I think it's a loss for both sides. Corey, where do you stand on Koby?
I feel like Koby Altman is a benefactor of the fact that it looks really bad for an organization that's trying to retain their star player to let go of their coach and their GM simultaneously. I feel like it was kind of reported that the Cavs were kind of doing a group think of maybe possibly leaning one way or the other, reflecting on both Koby Altman and JB Bickerstaff. And obviously they chose the JB Bickerstaff domino to fall instead, because like Jackson said, I think Koby has garnered some good faith from the Cavs brass because of his quick rebuild and the fact that the Cavs have hit probably on more draft picks than I think most teams have in the same stretch. They've built cornerstones out of the players they've drafted, and they have a lot of the players from that rebuild still on their roster, minus like Dylan Windler and Kevin Porter Jr., which you could argue that Kevin Porter Jr. probably would have been on the roster if he didn't have the character issues for a longer duration of his time. But overall, I think if the Donovan Mitchell thing wasn't looming over this organization, I think Koby's seat might be a little hotter than it is right now, but they have to let him and Donovan Mitchell kind of work together and try to rebuild this roster.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You don't want to risk going to doomsday mode and ruin all stability with the potential to keep a player like Donovan Mitchell. You don't want to send that signal. I will say, I think Koby has done a respectable job juggling the end of the LeBron era and managing to rebuild for the future. He was very aggressive in acquiring talent, many times adding players who didn't necessarily fit, but he prioritized getting talent over everything else. I think of drafting Darius Garland despite Colin Sexton on the roster, trading for Jarrett Allen when Andre Drummond was there. And this has led to a lot of the awkward pairings that we've seen throughout the years and especially recently. But the franchise climbed out of a rebuilding stage to kind of be on the forefront of being contenders. They're like right at the doorstep. They're just not quite there yet. With that said, though, this is a what have you done for me lately league. And as of late, You could say he whiffed on Ty Jerome, which it's not necessarily his fault because that injury kind of, messed everything up, but he whiffed on Niang. He didn't quite stick the landing with Max Strus. I enjoyed Max Strus, and I think you'll get a lot of value out of him if he stays in Cleveland, if they keep him, but didn't quite stick it this year. And if you go back to last year, whiffed on Rubio, letting go of Kevin Love, there's all these little moments where he dropped the ball. And so the Cavs are going to need this summer. Koby is going to need this summer to hit on the margins and make the right move. So I want to pose the question to Corey. Do you trust Koby to make the right moves in the draft, in his coaching search, and once the free agency floodgates open?
In the draft, I feel like you have to have some level of faith in Koby Altman making a good decision for the organization, just because, again, of the track record in the draft. I'd say the draft is probably his strongest area you could point to as a GM, at least. I don't know. I know he's not like in the scouting, but at the end of the day, he is a part of the final decision. And the team that he's built around him has done a fairly good job of indicating NBA level talent in the draft. Also, he's the organization as a whole under him has also done a good job of picking players off of the undrafted free agency pool and getting players on two-way deals and eventually on the roster. We've seen him make useful players at times out of players like Dean Wade and Lamar Stevens for a stretch. Overall, I think he has done a pretty good job. Free agency is hard for me to kind of judge him because I feel like the issue with free agency, especially when the margins the Cavs are operating under were pretty slim. You kind of were only able to take one swing in free agency last year, and that was Max Strus. And with free agency in general, you're kind of only limited to the options that are available. And the Cavs weren't able to put themselves in the situation where they could outbid for players they probably wanted more than Max Strus. They're always trying to finagle between the margins just with the way their cap was last season. So I don't think free agency this year looks to be much more promising even than last season for the Cavs. It's still going to be like, can you just hit on the Derrick Jones Jr. level type player that, like, I think when the Mavs signed him last offseason or so, they weren't like, oh boy, this is going to convert into a dynamic playoff player. You just hope that those types of swings can land massive gains. And that I feel like in the draft is going to be a strength. Free agency, I just think is a crapshoot.
I think I agree with everything that Corey says, but kind of to take it back to a different place. I think if you're looking at a less generous view of Koby, it's that the two things that he's done best is draft Evan Mobley and trade for Donovan Mitchell. Like those are the two things that raised the floor and ceiling of this team. And drafting Evan Mobley was kind of a no-brainer after, the Rockets passed up on him. The other options were, like Scotty Barnes was taken before people were expecting him, and you could have talked yourself into Suggs, but that seems like it was a pretty obvious choice in hindsight. And then the Donovan Mitchell trade, he's the one who accelerated this team. He's the reason why they got to the second round this year. He was the reason why they were the 4th seed last year. And like Corey talked about all the issues that they have in free agency. Well, they have those issues because they're so hamstrung with with the cap sheet, with the lack of assets, and that's because of the Donovan Mitchell trade. And Mitchell I think he was the right guy to bet on, but it might not have been the right time to bet on that guy because the rest of the pieces haven't really lived up to, he was supposed to be the guy, like he's supposed to be the cherry on top of the sundae, and he's more like the entire sundae. And that's sort of where, what if another team that was what if another competent team just offered that much for Mitchell? Would they be in the same spot that the Cavs currently are? And that's where I think kind of the criticism from Altman comes from. And that's where we have to kind of wait and see because, if he's just like giving him credit for getting out of the rebuild, it is, it's accurate, but it's also like he also hit the, sim to end button, and it seems like I don't know if this is sustainable, especially, if Mitchell wants out, then you don't own your draft pick until, you don't have full control of your draft pick until 2030, and you don't have Mitchell on your team. So it's really, this could be looked at very differently in 3 months.
A thing too with Donovan Mitchell is that if the Cavs, let's say, didn't make the Donovan Mitchell trade last season, then you're kind of heading into a situation this year where you have a roster maybe where the players are slightly more developed because they weren't operating under and around Donovan Mitchell's skill set. But then you're also in the, I guess we're in the OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam race. And I don't know if that would be as much of a needle mover for the Cavs as Donovan Mitchell was for them this year. It's all like with the NBA. It's like, you never know who's going to be available, but you also just can't like hold your assets and hope that a certain type of player that may never ask out is going to. So there's like pros and cons. And I feel like, yes, it was good for him to be aggressive, but you could also make the argument, like Jackson said, like maybe it was too early.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it just comes back to, he got us out of the rebuild by acquiring talent, Garland, Mobley, making the trade for Allen, making the trade for Mitchell. But the problem is trying to figure out how that talent works and rounding out the team on the margins. That's going to be what he needs to do this summer, whether it's through the draft, trades, free agency. If you're going to take that next step, he has to round out this team. And so it's kind of, I think it's going to be a make or break summer for Koby in the sense that if he drops the ball this summer, next year, I think his job security is starting to go out the window. Before we move to our next, go ahead.
Well, I want to bring up like the Allen trade. I think is like the best trade that he made because he bought low, but it's also like now the Cavs are in a position where they could be trading Allen, and it seems like they're also not going to get the value back that they likely would want for him, and that's sort of the problem with this whole thing where like they have had the success that they have because of the talent of their four guys, but them not fitting together and not being able to sort of make that all work out is kind of the problem. And that's, you know, what's going to differentiate between this team staying good forever or making that leap to being great and being like a real contender in this conference.
Yeah, and I do want to say I think they could still get a pretty good return for Allen, but we'll save that for another time. So we're going to shift and talk about another player's trade value. And so heading into our next topic, this one from Jake Fisher of Yahoo Sports, who says multiple teams are interested in Darius Garland this summer, some of which even prefer Garland to Trae Young, another potential trade candidate you can see on the market. I knew Jackson would have a comment on that because what was it? A couple episodes we discussed that hypothetical, but he continues to say that the Cavs could yield a serious return for Garland. This relates to the recent reports that Clutch Sports would consider asking for a trade if Donovan Mitchell extends in Cleveland to free Garland up in the backcourt somewhere else. But focusing this conversation on Garland's current value, Jackson, let's hear your thoughts on this report. Do you believe DG's trade value is actually this high, even in spite of that recent slump?
I don't really, at least not more than Trae Young. And I know that Trae Young has issues that Garland doesn't have, but Garland is just, I think he's a limited player, and I don't know how he gets much, like, I don't know how he breaks through to the next level of not being somebody who is of this caliber, which is right now, it's kind of like if everything works out well, he's kind of a 10th or 11th guy on an all-star team, which is a good player, but it's not a, you know, all NBA type player, which I think that you could say that Trae Young, you know, still is an all NBA type player if he's in the right situation. So I find that hard to believe, but at the same time, there aren't many guys his age during his first max contract that kind of come on the market. So I get that, but I don't know.
I think that Darius Garland's a big benefactor from the fact that I think the league probably views Trae Young, this is specifically in that comparison, as like a more finished product. And I think people look at Darius Garland being still considered one of the young players in the league who's proven himself to a certain extent, that they feel like there's something that can be built upon. And with Trae Young, you kind of feel like you're getting what you're getting. And I think teams like will always tell themselves that, well, if he was under our staff, he'll be completely different. And as Tony pointed out in his article that came out recently, like Darius Garland's issue is more that we feel like he's kind of staying the same player, and it's not going to be a change of scenery that's going to change his situation. It's more what he's doing. himself becoming a more restrictive perimeter player and not really being multifaceted and like the three-level scorer that we think he is, or at least I bet the league perceives him to be.
Well, yeah, because he can't score at one of those levels, which is the most important level to score at, honestly. And he can't draw fouls. But anyway, that's...
Yeah, I think on the Trey talking point, and I don't know exactly if I believe that Garland's trade value is higher. I think the argument that I would see is that Trey is a very heliocentric player, and he hasn't shown that he can break out of that. The DeJounte Murray pairing went very poorly. And if you're looking at DG, you think, sure, it's not a raging success, but he has shown that he can play alongside Donovan Mitchell to a degree, at least more so than Trae Young was able to do so with his backcourt running mate. And so I think really what it comes down to is I think a lot of teams will convince themselves to buy low on the DG stock right now and say, hey, he's not getting his full. I don't necessarily agree with this, but I think a lot of teams could talk themselves into, hey, he's not really unlocking his full potential next to Mitchell. We're going to trade for DG and we'll get all that potential ourselves. So I think that would result in more of a bidding war than a lot of people would assume, considering how bad Garland looked this year. But I mean, he's still 24 years old and he's coming off the worst season he's had in a long time. I think a lot of teams will convince themselves that he will bounce back and rise up significantly from that season he just had. And I think a lot of teams will be willing to sign up for that.
Yeah, kind of. I see that because one of the things that I think the Hawks did a really big disservice to Trae Young is some of the ideas that they had were okay, but they kind of missed on the execution on all of them. You look at Jarrett Culver, theoretically he should have been a good fit. He wasn't. You know, DeAndre Hunter was supposed to be a better player. Okongwu hasn't really developed like we thought. Cam Reddish. So, and then the DeJounte Murray, I think, is just a really bad fit. I think DeJounte Murray, everything you said about Garland in your article is like more true for DeJounte Murray, but Garland is a much more skilled player and a much better player. So I think it's just a really tough fit for both of them on that Hawks team. So it's tough where like Trae Young is much more skilled and can do a lot more things. I know that he has the problem with Young is that his limitations are more glaring and it's kind of more irritating. Like the foul drawing is irritating. His inability to do anything on defense is irritating. Garland's a better defender. Garland doesn't have that same baggage. But I do think that if you're looking at both players, I would have an easier time talking myself into Trae Young being the guy who's actually he could fit along in this system. I get why a team like the Spurs doesn't want to rock the boat too much, but overall, I don't get it.
I see your point there. I mean, Trae has shown that just immense offensive upside at times where Garland hasn't been as consistent there or really just as explosive as Trae Young can be. So I get the idea there. And I do want to hit on the defense you mentioned before we move on because you always hear the concerns of Garland's defense and really the backcourt of Mitchell and Garland saying, oh, you can't survive with those two guards defensively. And while, yes, I agree for the most part that is usually how things work, and I think plenty of teams could give them problems, I just want to point out it has not been a limitation for DG or the Cavs up to this point. I kind of think it's a non-factor so far. We just, over the last 2 years, even the last 3 years, it just hasn't been a thing that has truly hurt the Cavs. Not nearly as much as you hear from fans and other people. It's not really something that bothers them as much. Maybe that's a result of the two bigs. Or, I couldn't explain exactly why it is. I think Darius Garland is just a little better on defense than he gets credit for. So I did want to mention that.
I do want to say the size is much more of a concern for me on offense, where it's easier to trap both of them. And they don't, when you're 6'1", 6'2", it's a lot easier to trap. It's a lot harder to find those passes out. And when you have two guys who are the only two ball handlers on your team, and they're both easily trappable, it's really tough to sometimes counteract that. And I think that's where my concerns mostly come from. But as you pointed out, Tony, in your article, which is on fearthesword.com if you haven't checked it out, it's Garland needs to grow as a player no matter where he's at, because he's not like Trae Young is somebody you can build an entire offense around. you can't have a heliocentric Darius Garland offense and expect it to actually work. So he needs to be able to fit into the team concept. And it's not that he is a selfish player and that he hasn't, but there are things that he needs to improve on. And I think he could improve on those things next to Mitchell. But some of the limitations that both those guards have on the offensive side of the ball with being able to be trapped and stuff like that, I think requires a different configuration of the team.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And the last thing that I'll mention here, just kind of in relation to that article that I wrote, a good point that I saw some
on fearthesword.com.
On fearthesword.com. Check it out. Great place. A lot of great writers there, or so I hear. But something that I failed to really mention or articulate that I saw someone bring up is that some of it likely comes down to an adjustment mentally for Garland as far as accepting playing a little more without the ball. You know, one of the things that Jackson has pointed out a lot, and then I tried to highlight in the article, is that being on the ball is what got Darius Garland here. But if he wants to raise his ceiling to being a potential championship caliber player or just someone who goes deep in the playoffs, he's going to have to learn how to play without the ball. And maybe this is the point that I failed to mention. Maybe it's easier for him to accept that if he's playing alongside a Zion or a Wembanyama or a front court player rather than someone else in the backcourt who is kind of just there's more of an overlap there that I wanted to mention a little bit here, but we're going to be talking about this all summer.
And last thing that I want to say is I don't know how much of this is on the coaching staff too, because you look at a lot of the times when Mitchell has the ball or when anyone else has the ball, really, Garland's super spaced out where he's like drifting back almost to half court, where he's almost like the super outlet, let's reset everything type of guy. And I don't know that's not how, that's not how Steph Curry operates off the ball.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's like a Darius Garland thing or if that's a team thing. I will say things like pushing the tempo, I feel like that's a Darius Garland problem.
Yeah.
Because you see the tempo go up when he's not in there, and you always saw, John always says this, you always see JB Bickerstaff on the sideline waving him come on, especially late in games. So it's hard to differentiate sometimes between Darius Garland problems and team coaching issues that we see. So
it's a great point.
It's tough to kind of parse that all out, especially when you're, representing Darius Garland or you're trying to build a team around Donovan Mitchell. So,
yeah, I mean, that's interesting too, just because as far as the coaching stuff goes too, and the offense, I think other players other than Garland also don't move without the ball as much. So it makes you wonder there. Even the pace goes up when Mitchell's out there. So I don't think that was a coaching thing. But even when Mitchell was out there alone, you didn't really get as much off-ball movement. So maybe that's some of coaching.
And you need
probably
better
a mixture
screens.
of both.
And you need good screen setters. You're looking at Jarrett. Jarrett Allen's the only good screen setter for one of the bigs, which is really tough because if you have two bigs, you need to be they both need to be setting really good screens all the time to free up the guys who can dribble and shoot. So that's, there's a lot of things you can point to that aren't Darius Garland issues. If you just take Darius Garland off the team, it's not they now can set screens and now everybody starts moving off ball. But it's also that could happen with Darius Garland still on the team. So that's why James Borrego.
It's a good transition to our final topic, actually. Speaking of the two bigs and lack of screen setting. For our final story, we have another Windy special. He believes Mobley will receive a rookie max extension from the Cavaliers, and he went on to say that any team in the NBA would offer Mobley that same extension if they were in that position. Corey, two-part question. One, do you agree Mobley would get that deal from any team? And secondly, do we think Mobley has earned it? Does it make sense for him to get that deal?
I feel like the answer could apply to both. Yes, I feel like every team would do it. And I feel like the reason that every team's going to do it is because how the NBA just is all about retaining your assets. Mobley is the biggest asset the Cavs have, arguably, outside of Donovan Mitchell. But internally, this is considered their homegrown diamond in the rough, Evan Mobley. And overall, every team is going to take that swing on the upside that Mobley can provide. That's the reason the Cavs drafted him. That's the reason we're still talking about how there's room for him to grow. It's the reason that Jarrett Allen's potentially going to be moved out is because they want to capitalize on what Mobley can bring to this team. And if they feel like him being the 5 is going to take this team to the next level, he's truly the pendulum the deciding factor for this Cavs team of what they're going to be in the next 5 years. If Mobley takes the jump, A, he's worth the max that they're going to be paying him, but B, he could potentially be a top 20 player in the league at minimum if he reaches his ceiling offensively, along with the defense that we've seen from him thus far. I think it's irregardless of the situation of any of the teams in the league. It just comes down to everyone's going to take that swing on the type of player that Evan Mobley can be. Has he deserved it? Definitely. I would argue not. I think overall, offensively, he's stagnated over the past few years to where you're kind of now reaching for what you think he's going to be offensively more than what the trajectory would lead you to believe he's going to be. His incremental growth hasn't been something where it's been sustained for arguably more than a game at a time up until this Boston series, where it was forced for him to play in the position that make him flash more offensively. And I just think that even though he hasn't really shown a max level of play, you just have to take that swing.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, the thing is, like, he was a Defensive Player of the Year finalist in his second season, and he probably should have won. So
Definitely should have won.
He definitely should have won.
Dude, drop coverage. I mean, it wins every time.
Did you?
Thanks, Brooke.
Did you write that article for Unfair the Sword last year, or did you only like talk about writing it? I forget.
I did. I'm pretty sure I wrote a story.
Wow.
The Stray.
We'll have to look into that. We'll have to look into. No, because I'm
pretty sure I wrote a whole story on it, Jackson.
Okay, all right. You can edit that out if you did.
No, we're leaving it in.
Leave it in.
People need to know.
Okay, that's fine.
People need to know.
But yeah, like, he definitely should have won. So I mean, defense usually takes a while for bigs to kind of get a handle on, and he immediately came in and was a day one impact. And I think his impact is only going to grow as he becomes a better rebounder, which he should just by adding more strength and maturing physically. So that alone is worth a max. I think the offensive issues are definitely worth highlighting, but this is the same thing as the Garland conversation where it's like, is some of these issues because of fit? I think they are. Are they because the team hasn't asked him to grow in the ways that he needs to? I think it's really tough when you're talking about Mobley because he's had to split time between center and power forward, where when he puts the starting lineup, he needs to be like a power forward. He needs to have the skill set of somebody who can dribble, who can shoot the ball, who can do those things. But he's also playing 15 minutes a game where he's the center, where he's going to have to be a better screen center and rebounder. And I feel like forcing him, or like not allowing him to choose either lane, but kind of forcing him to grow in both areas has kind of left him like stagnating in both. So I think that some clarity there would show that he's more worthy of a max on the offensive end. But yeah, I don't think you think twice about this.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think if he showed more of that offensive upside, it would be the absolute no-brainer that everyone assumed it would be when he was drafted. But I still think it's basically a no-brainer. I mean, everyone knows where I stand on Mobley. His floor is already so high just because of his defense. Quick stat, Mobley was eliminated from the playoffs 2 weeks ago, and he still leads all players in stocks, which are blocks and steals.
Take that.
36 of them. The next closest, it's Luka and Gafford tied with 34, and they played 4 more games than Mobley. So the dude is a generational defender. He's your cornerstone behind Donovan Mitchell. I think he's shown enough offensive flashes to where you feel, if you're the Cavs, there's no argument for not just giving him the max and betting on that potential. You do it 10 out of 10 times, I think, and so does every other NBA team. The floor is already high, like I said. And the ceiling, as Jackson was pointing out, we really aren't sure how much higher he can climb offensively because he just really hasn't been in a position where the Cavs have forced him to become that. We saw the Boston series. I think people maybe would have argued against the max extension for Mobley a little more if he didn't have that Boston series. When he came out and played the way he did, at this point, it's not a surprise at all that he's going to get a max extension, and rightfully so.
I do think Corey's point is worth exploring further though, because when you are in a salary cap league, it does matter how you use that salary. Yeah. And if you're using a max salary slot on Evan Mobley, he needs to improve. Like, is the 2023-2024 version of Evan Mobley worth a max salary just on its own, just in a vacuum? I think you could argue, no, it's not. So I think that's kind of like, there's reason to be hesitant because we've seen situations where this hasn't worked out, where it's like, if we were podcasting about the Minnesota Timberwolves 5 or 6 years ago, like, is it Andrew Wiggins worth the max salary? It's like, yes, he was rookie of the year. He showed so many things.
NBA champion Andrew Wiggins.
Right. And he didn't do that on a max contract, that's for sure. And when he started getting more money, that's when the problem started for his team. So that's where
could be us, according to the NBA Twitter machines, trade machines.
Yeah, well, that's kind of where the Jarrett Allen trade value conversation comes into play here. But like, Andrew Wiggins at the time was like, yeah, I promise I'll get better. And he, kind of stagnated in Minnesota. And you saw like the player that Wiggins could become was worth a max contract. The player he actually was and stayed at was not worth a max contract. So it's always worth pointing that out. And I think that's kind of a similar conversation with Garland, where it's like,
well, the difference is, you mentioned Garland. I thought you were going to say Mobley. The difference is that Wiggins had the entire team kind of built around his development and still stagnated. Right. Mobley did not get that. He was not afforded that.
Right. So, yeah, and I think it's a no-brainer, but I do want to say that, like, Corey is not just like Corey's bringing up a good point by, like, bringing that up.
To counter my own point is just that it's hard with Mobley because, like, in a vacuum, most rookies that get drafted in the top 3 are put in a situation where they're able to develop and highlight their skills. Mobley's timeline was just rapidly accelerating because the team's goals and aspirations kept on getting knocked up with every incoming player or players that became all-stars and took the lead. Mobley basically came in as the 4th option, and for a top 3 player in the league, I feel, or in the draft, it's really hard for a player to develop alongside a team that's also has 3 other players who are trying to improve as well. And they're not going to build an entire offense around Mobley, trying to get him to develop in certain spots. It's like they're forcing him to fit, like Jackson said, in certain spots. And that's just stagnating everything, because it's never going to be like, all right, guys, let's run like 15 to 20 offensive sets where Mobley is just going to be getting the ball in certain spots, and let's just hammer that home so it becomes a strength down the road. It's like, Mobley, just take advantage of whatever situations and opportunities are in front of you.
Yeah, that is worth pointing out, because it's not like the Timberwolves drafted Anthony Edwards and said, all right, let's go get Zach LaVine back, so that's, it is tough.
I think it ties back into how we started the episode talking about Koby, because listen, if you're going to give Mobley the max extension, you need to start prioritizing him like a max player, which means potentially trading Jarrett Allen, potentially finding a way to give him more opportunities. If you're going to give him that much money, you got to treat him like a player making that much money. And so far, they have not. So it's going to be a really interesting summer. That's going to do it for this week's recap of the news. Thank you to everyone who watched or listened. I'm excited to keep running this format throughout the summer. And we have all sorts of different pods on the way. So one more time, hit that subscribe and leave a comment with any hot takes or ideas that you have throughout the summer, because we could end up using some of them throughout these episodes. So drop your comments below if you want to be included in an episode potentially. And with all that being said, go Cavs.
I agree. Go Cavs. Brian, if you want to be included in this episode, you can leave some comments below.